going to go to the next session, which I'm so excited about, talking about intersegmental alignment and how our systems work together. So take it away, Stacy.
Thank you so much. And actually, I'm going to turn it over to Yarek if he is available to introduce our next special guest speaker.
All right, good afternoon then. Thank you very much. To wrap up the day, there she is, Dr. Emily Magruder, Director of the Institute for Teaching and Learning at California State University, Office of the Chancellor. And she's going to speak about her role at the Institute. And I just hope we can learn something from the discussion for community colleges in California. Dr. Magruder, please.
Thank you, Yarek, and everyone. It's so exciting and inspiring to be part of this conversation today. I am going to, let's see, hopefully share my screen, and there we go. And let's make it a presentation. Hopefully that is working. So let me just say that I don't know how many of you all are aware of this, but the California State University is in the midst of an historic initiative to increase student success that includes increasing 2- and 4-year graduation rates for our transfer students. And as has been much of the conversation over these 2 days, articulation between the two systems based on deep learning and competencies, along with collaboration on effective teaching and learning, are what will make these goals achievable for us. So there's some good news in this that I will share in a moment, as I'll give you a moment to look at those slides. I will just say that when the Graduation Initiative 2025, as we call it, was announced, which was back in 2016, I myself had just moved from a faculty position on one of our campuses. I was a faculty member at California State University, Dominguez Hills, to direct the Institute for Teaching and Learning in the Chancellor's office. And so the goals admittedly raised some fears. Some were concerned that the purpose was to push students through and that the result was going to be lessening the quality of the degree. But as I often assured my colleagues, if that were the case, I would quit my job because we're all about deep learning and ensuring that our students who earn 2- and 4-year degrees, that it is going to help them realize their personal and professional goals. And so it's always been a deep belief of mine that accelerating learning and deepening learning go hand in hand. And of course, I'm preaching to the choir here today, but it can also go the other way. Deepening learning can also accelerate learning. So in this slide, if you've had a moment to look at it, there's good news about our transfer goals. And this was just shared with our Board of Trustees this week. And I think it references back Davis Jenkins' talk this morning. Associate degrees for transfer, which we're now almost a decade into these, a lot of hard work, collaborative work across the segments, they work, especially if students opt for a similar pathway when they reach a CSU. So this slide is illustrating here that the students who transfer to a CSU with an ADT and opt for a similar pathway at their CSU, they have 2-year graduation rates that are higher than students coming in with different patterns. And the same holds true for 4-year rates. But I'm going to take another cue from Davis Jenkins' presentation this morning. My ears perked up when he said, I'd take a light the fire course over an ADT or a pathway. And this will nicely allow me to connect to everything else that's gone on this morning. Articulation, and there's been a whole lot of work around articulation that has made these associate degrees for transfer possible. It often focuses on aligning courses with an emphasis on course descriptions and SLOs, and these are very important. But what about collaboration around teaching and learning? How do we ensure that more courses are light the fire learning experiences for students? Now I'm going to show a headline here that came up just this week. And this is probably not news to anyone here. The article, if you want to go back and read it, it had a whole lot of dirty little secrets about higher ed. And this is not one of the 5 secrets that was too hot to share, but this one jumped out since my primary focus now is professional development. And this reflects my own experience. My graduate training was preparing me to be an expert in my discipline. And there was this assumption that just by virtue of being an expert with passion, that I would know how to teach. So let me just share a quick scenario. This week, I had the opportunity as part of a grant project. We have a grant from the National Association of System Heads to have 540 faculty across 8 of our campuses take a course on effective college teaching. And I was having a conversation with one of the campuses participating with the provost, and he shared a story, which was that at a town hall, well, first of all, let me tell the story. At a town hall in the fall, 1 week away from exams, a student stood up and shared that going into exams, he had no idea whether he was going to pass or fail the course. Now, as we've learned, whenever we hear something, we want to always be sure we're not making biased assumptions about what's going on. But it's really possible that one thing that was going on for that student is that there wasn't enough of that assessment at the basic level, that there wasn't enough ongoing checking for understanding so that the student was learning how to monitor their own learning. So as the panelists that have just preceded have shared today, the pandemic has created an openness to thinking and rethinking how we teach. We had to leave the conditions that we were comfortable and familiar with, that we all love, being on the ground in the classroom with our students. Every aspect of our work became unfamiliar, which means we can look at it in new ways. And so one of the things that's happened in the CSU that's really quite exciting is that we have offered professional learning this year on an unprecedented scale. When I talk with faculty developers across the country, we often think that it would be an incredibly aspirational goal to reach 20% of the faculty on our campuses with professional development programming. And the CSU this year, we actually reached 60% of our faculty with long, what I would call robust programming that lasted more than 8 hours, often several days to prepare to teach for the fall. So I want to think for a moment about professional development, and just to say that I know I didn't think explicitly about how people learn until I became a faculty developer. I certainly always aimed to be a good teacher, but my framework for doing that wasn't grounded in learning science, and especially not cognitive neuroscience. So if I were going to recommend one thing for faculty in higher ed to read, there are a lot of great books out there. People have been sharing them throughout this symposium. One of them might be How People Learn. I don't know if you're familiar with it, but it's a meta-analysis that draws 3 conclusions about what we know about learning. And this was back in 1999. There's been a more updated version issued since then. But prior knowledge matters, novices are not experts, and metacognition works to bridge the expert-novice gap. So I just want to focus briefly on prior knowledge and then move us to the idea about expertise. Certainly, prior knowledge is always hovering around our conversations about transfer. As students move through their entire life and education, right, the people at the next level always want to know what they've learned at the one prior to that. There's been reference today about remediation reform, which both the California State University and the community colleges have been engaged in intensely for the last few years. And that encourages us to think about prior knowledge, right? We have to be more able to find out exactly what are the things that students need to brush up on in mathematics, for example, provide the support at that moment rather than having them work entirely through a course sequence when there are really only a few things that they need to strengthen. Equity goals also demand we think about prior knowledge. We have to be sure that we're aware of how cultural epistemologies held by students and instructors impact the classroom. And of course, now with the pandemic, there's much concern about learning loss, what it means for students in K-12 now as they enter post-secondary education, but also every step of the way. So let's just think for a moment about expertise as we think about how our systems can work together. This image here reminds us that experts have systems of organization. We might think that the brains of experts are well-organized closets. And when we think about sort of the larger picture of what we're trying to achieve when we all teach the students that we share responsibility for, that expertise has levels. And maybe those first two things there are a little bit easier for us to assess, and how we assess the ways that our students are learning to organize knowledge and ways to facilitate retrieval and application might be a little bit harder. So these images are nice metaphors. That on the left there is a pile of clothes, and that's meant to sort of playfully represent for us that for novices, they might have a lot of clothes, but they don't have a way to organize them yet. And that image on the right might be the image of a not only a well-organized closet, but someone who then is able to pull together knowledge in new and novel ways to create new possibilities. What does faculty development have to do with all of this? As experts, we forget what it was like to be novices, and we develop blind spots. When we have the opportunity to learn together with faculty our own disciplines, but also not in our own disciplines, we can surface our expert thinking processes and thus better apprentice students into them. And, why not do that across segments with our colleagues, again, who work to cumulatively give students the education that they're going to take into the rest of their life with them. So our larger goal, of course, might be represented here, is that the big goal is that we're trying to develop lifelong learners. And sometimes this larger goal can get lost when we're focused too mechanistically or too simplistically on assessment. So to produce skillful learners, we have to think about how we structure instruction and how we structure assessment. And so the third piece of that finding from how people learn is that metacognition, thinking about thinking, can help bridge that gap for students between novice and expert. But I also want to think about, let me just backtrack for a moment. If we're going to build metacognition into the way that our students learn, that means, of course, the work that we've all been engaged in and talking about over these 2 days of redesigning instruction and assessment so that happens, so that students are thinking about how they're learning so they can transfer that into all the novel experiences they'll encounter when they have moved beyond our classrooms and our degrees. But we also want to think about, right, how do faculty learn? How do instructors learn to teach better? And we want to think about, we've had some conversations here, what faculty development looks like in this context. So I've playfully taken the language there about metacognition and suggested that if we have a metacognitive approach to instruction, that can help instructors learn to take control of their teaching by defining teaching goals and monitoring their progress toward achieving them. So I could describe a few intersegmental projects that I've been involved with. If you'd like to hear about them, some of the most exciting work that I've been able to do in my time directing the Institute for Teaching and Learning in the Chancellor's office has been in projects that have had community college faculty and California State University faculty working together side by side. There are questions that I have here on the screen, but I also want to know what questions you have. So I'm going to stop sharing now and open it up.
All right, fast.
See here.
Yarrick, I believe we've lost your audio.
Just when I fix my camera, now the microphone is not working. Sorry.
Mhm.
So fascinating discussion. Really appreciate the points to end the day. You have asked earlier in your talk, rhetorical question, I suppose. How about collaboration around teaching and learning? If you could perhaps, from that perspective, address what it is that we could do between the two systems, or how do you think we could structure our discussions here, again, in terms of faculty preparation and making sure that students attain competencies that they need to perform in your system?
Well, thank you, Yarrick, and I see that there's a shout out there to Cal State LA's Center for Effective Teaching and Learning. In fact, much of what I'm sharing today comes from my collaboration with the team there. It's really an excellent team. What I think that happens is that sort of everything that we're talking about, that we know about how students learn, and that, right, defining the outcomes and folding assessment of how students are learning into that at every level, from checking for understanding every step of the way inside of a course to building up the larger assessment of student learning within a program or a degree. We can turn around and apply that to think about the learning for faculty. So for example, in one of the projects that I'm involved with right now, which is with funding from the California Education Learning Lab, which again is we have at the state level, the governor's office putting funding into professional development. We have a project that some people here may be involved with that's based in reading apprenticeship. So I'm partnering with my close colleague, Nika Hogan of the California Community College Success Network, and using the idea of reading apprenticeship. And for those, I may be talking to people who are familiar, but we often think that students have learned to read back in third grade, right? That in third grade you shift from learning to read to reading to learn. But in fact, one of the key ways that we as experts in each of our disciplines communicate is through reading and writing. And so our project brings faculty, actually STEM faculty and math faculty together with a broad definition of reading, but thinking of any text, including a formula or a piece of equipment in a lab, is something that we read together. And developing, again, to touch on what Davis Jenkins said this morning, active learning, thinking about how bringing the act of reading into the classroom as an active learning and problem solving activity, where we show students how we read it, so we surface our expert thinking, but then give students multiple opportunities and well-structured peer groups so that they can read together, so that they start to see, and we make transparent how we're all moving from novice to expert and doing that in expert ways. That's great professional learning. Now, a lot of what I've heard people talking about, faculty learning communities, can take place in a campus context. It's so exciting when we can do it across institutions and across segments, because if we can sort of develop together, we can collaborate, not just at the level of course IDs and course descriptions and student learning outcomes and agree that these are equivalent, but that we actually form our own learning communities together where we have start to define and have common conversations about what expertise in these areas are. Then we're all better able to define our instructional practices and our assessment practices so that we're apprenticing all of our students into that together.
I think very much in line with this thinking. There is just a question that just popped up in our Q&A section. On one end, course outline of record dictates course content, right? So we do need to have it, but then some may find it restrictive, and I think that's what the question is about. What advice do you have when our articulation officers tell us that one college won't give articulation unless we add in another topic? We want our classes to count for transfer, right? Why is there so much micromanagement over the list of content topics?
Oh, well, gosh, I don't know how I can address that question of micromanagement, but in terms of, that's my concern, is that too times we get lost in the details of articulation. And I think that if prior to that we had a basis, I think there was a conversation about trust today. How do we develop trust across the segments so that we understand that those artifacts that we use for articulation, right? That course outline, that learning outcomes that we put into those articulation systems, it's when we've been able to have the opportunity to have conversations together that we have trust across those systems, so that we know that the language that we put on the paper to describe the learning outcomes is connected to that deeper sense of what we do to teach students and to assess their learning.
Thank you very much. If you could, again, go back to one of the comments that you made earlier, and this has to do with the fact that as the higher ed article says, faculty in higher education have very little teaching preparation, right? What are the systems? Do you have any hiring perhaps practices, or once faculty are hired, what support do you offer to those newly arriving faculty members?
Those are excellent questions. I think and this is what the field that I've moved into, educational development, thinks a lot about these days. We construct professional development still in higher education, at least in the four-year universities. I don't know if it's different in the two-year system, but we structure it as optional and extra, and we're often looking for ways to incentivize faculty to do it. What I can say is that, what the pandemic opened up is that all of a sudden everything was unfamiliar, and there was this incredible openness. So if faculty developers and the CSU went from offering program and sometimes hoping that people would come and that it would fill up so that they could continue to have funding, we then all of a sudden had the opposite problem. Everybody was coming in. So I wouldn't have wished a pandemic on us for that to happen. But the question is, how do we go from here? So we start to look with, creating intrinsic motivation. If the professional learning is of high value, we might use a stipend. I heard a reference in the panel earlier of bringing unions to the table and talking about how we can remove any barriers to getting people into these situations. But we have to ensure that the professional learning experience is rewarding for its intrinsic reward, and then think carefully about how we build in recognition. A stipend is one form of recognition. But community recognition, I'm finding a lot of the faculty developers this year talking about the faculty who are participating in programs this year while they're still teaching, which is incredible with all the demands that the pandemic is placing on people. That the community having the opportunity to be together and to talk about teaching is a reward in and of itself. Now, whether we would get to the point where that would be recognized in our system differently in reappointment and promotion and tenure decisions for all of our faculty, whether they're on the tenure track or off the tenure track, there are a lot of people that hope that might happen. But for now, I think that community and finding our passion for teaching helps. And I just I love the idea of being able to do that more across our systems.
Excellent, thank you. Thank you very much. Thank you, Dr. Magruder. We skipped the break. We'll just go ahead and finish up the day number 2 of the conference. Thank you, panelists. I'll take it over to turn it over to Stacy, and let's finish it up. Thank you very much.
Thank
you
you
so much. And thank you so much, Dr. Magruder. I think we're opening these pathways to dialogue, right? To make those connections happen, to help to make sure everyone is supported. So at the end of the day, we are really serving students in the most equitable way that we can. So I'm inviting the rest of the planning group and for panelists who would like to participate in this kind of next steps discussion. And we hope you're ready for our attendees in the chat to also engage with this conversation as well. You've been hearing a lot for the past several days. Where do we go next? What is the next step for this work for you? What is the next step that you need from this community? What is the next step for the SLO Symposium 2022? So please feel free to engage in chat. I've also, we have Susie Nitzel from Fresno City College helping us on the back end. If you would like to voice up your opinion, please raise your hand and she can also unmute you as well. But we have about 17 minutes to kind of go through this together, and we'll turn it over. In terms of next steps, and our panelists can also jump in as well as what they see next steps potentially for this work too.
So I think that from my perspective as an organizer, and this is again SLO Symposium number 8, so I'm just absolutely ecstatic about the fact that it actually has been so many years, and look where we are. This someone already mentioned, right? We never had that many conversations about teaching and learning before. So I'm certainly very optimistic. I'm looking forward towards the future. Now, as far as our technology here, I think a thing or two may be said about that, simply because Zoom is here with us to stay. We can record these materials, we can distribute them. We are going to be able to disseminate the message, to really make sure that the field, meaning our faculty and faculty leaders, learning leaders out there, are not alone anymore. So that's really the goal. So again, as far as that part is concerned, I'm certainly happy to see how we are moving forward as a team, as a group, as a community. When it comes to next year's symposium, we already asked the question. Maybe I'm not sure if it's going to require any type of voting and whatnot, but certainly looks like Zoom is a great way to really bring, as you saw, fantastic speakers from across the spectrum, across the country. I think that's very important, and the lesson that cannot be forgotten for next time around. It's just much easier, much more feasible to reach out to people who are geographically far away from us. So again, thank you very much for all the speakers, and thank you for all the work that has been accomplished. The planning team has just been absolutely fantastic. You saw the emails, you saw the work that went into this. It's just truly amazing effort. So kudos to everyone who's been involved in this. It's been a great pleasure working with you.
Great, and we're already getting some comments in the chat, Yarek, around distance options for this type of conference, right, in the future, so we can more widely distribute this information and get people engaged. So definitely something to consider, and I am highly encouraging all of our attendees. We will be putting the evaluations both for the Friday sessions, if you attended those, as well as today's Saturday sessions into the chat, where you can also weigh in. What do you want SLO Symposium 2022 to kind of shape up into as well? And I'm also going to make sure, yep, more of us are being spotlighted as well to kind of reflect on some of what's been happening. Where do we go from here?
I think, Stacey, the one thing I might add is that I know that we've shared so many resources and had just a really profound experience hearing from so many people. And it can feel overwhelming as an audience member and as a participant, leaving and thinking about how are we going to implement all of these things, and how are we just going to, start on day one, Monday, when I go back onto email or join my class, how am I going to do all these things? And I think that I was reflecting on what Dr. Dias was saying, and that really maybe we can just start by identifying, like, what's one thing I'm going to bring to my team on Monday? What's one thing I'm going to bring to my students? And what's one thing I'm going to bring to myself? Remembering that that self-care is also a really important part of the equity work. So thank you for that.
Such a great point, Anthony.
For me, I just wanted to share that just in being on part of the planning team, I was just so inspired by everything that I was learning, that I reached out to some folks that I know are really equity minded on my campus. And I met with them last week, actually. And this person and I, we just said, maybe we just need to start this from the ground up, you and I. And we both agreed to invite one or two other people to join our group. And this semester, we've invited each other into each other's Canvas courses to be observers, and we are going to meet with each other regularly and give each other feedback about how we can be more equitable practitioners, equitable faculty members, and just be really honest with each other, speaking truth and love, and just go through this journey this semester and document our experience so that we can take it back to the campus about a model that maybe others can follow.
Great, and that's such a good point, Libby, and it makes me step back and think too of the purposefulness of our conference theme this year as well, right? Ensuring equitable learning, because I think we're realizing that we ourselves in the SLO assessment space might have already been siloed previous to these kind of larger discussions and conversations. And so it was with a lot of intentionality, right, that we thought about how do we turn it, wrap this in with guided pathways? How do we wrap this in with equity? And how do we start seeing ourselves more as learning leaders? Because it's going to take us working with folks who are, working in those areas across our campuses to make it a collective effort, right? If we are trying to change the campus one person as ourselves, that's just not going to work. But if we can bring more allies on board too, who see these connections, right? Guide pathways, pillars 1 through 3, what are you pointing towards, right? If it's not ensure equitable learning at the end of the day, we have built a better system to get students through, but we still did not ensure on our promise to our students that we are providing the best education possible for them. So panelists, thank you so much for sticking it out also too. If you have any thoughts, feel free to jump in as well.
I just want to jump in and piggyback on what Ms. Curiel just said a moment ago, because I thought it was so awesome. The value of peer observation and peer feedback cannot be understated. And something as simple as what she's saying, like inviting each other to each other's classes, like come check me out, see what I'm doing, where can I grow? Those kind of things. It's so simple and it's not that complicated, but it's so fruitful. And also just the feeling of being supported and feeling like someone has my back makes a huge difference. So I'm really glad that you shared that and that you're starting that grassroots movement on your own, Libby. That's awesome.
And could I piggyback on that and say, I mean, having an open door to our classroom where people could come in and observe is not something that everybody in higher ed is willing to do. What if we could do that again across the systems? And then maybe if we could see into each other's classes and understand, build this trust, like, oh, we are all teaching. Maybe if there are times when articulation is bumpy, it's because of just a plain old lack of knowledge and lack of trust that we're all teaching students toward the same goal. And given that our system now has these segments, like we could make the handoff and the transition for the students smoother. And having Canvas courses, right, gives us a way to do that might make it easier than it was in the past.
just reflecting, we're getting a lot of love in the chat and we're sending that back to you as well. Thank you so much for attending. I know it's even a Saturday and you are here to learn, you're here to engage, and we are so thankful for the work that you are doing on behalf of your students and then also on your campuses as well to make transformation happen in education. So thank you all for that as well. We also have folks sharing, great idea, Dr. Magruder, in terms of maybe that's opening the doorways. We have a connection to you now, so maybe there is an opportunity to work between at least our two systems, the California Community College system and the CSU, to maybe start piloting some of those opportunities. And I think that goes a long way to also opening up the conversation more about pathways too, right? Having that alignment and for having as much as a seamless transition as possible for our students who do end up transferring, because we also want to mitigate some of that transfer shock and then work together to best support them in a wraparound sort of ways. Libby brings up a great question in chat. Who's going to invite the UCs? Who's got that connection?
Well, I think we already talked about it. There is some venues, so it's something that's to be worked on. Maybe that way. But again, we are not alone. Dr. Magruder is here, and I'm sure that she can probably ensure some connection with our UC colleagues just as much. So something for us to explore in the next weeks and months.
I know there are people willing, and again, I think that maybe we've figured out that some of the barriers that were there in the past, a forum like this, anybody can come.
Dr. Bloom or Dr. Dias, any kind of final takeaway thoughts, advice for our group before we wrap up?
Well, one thing that occurred to me as you were all talking about how hard this is and how you want to start by introducing one thing at a time, it occurred to me that that's a very humane and appropriate response, but that's not what we usually ask of our students. We usually ask our students to do everything and to do it perfectly. And so just in terms of like the metacognition of our own learning as opposed to what we take into the classroom, we want to be realistic and humane about what it's actually possible to change in the course of a semester. And in some ways, what we've built into the structures of our colleges and universities is impossible for anybody to actually do. I mean, your students have very complicated lives. They're taking several courses at a time in different disciplines and different fields, all of which have different conventions and read different things and write and produce different things, and expecting them to do it all flawlessly or expecting ourselves to do this flawlessly is unrealistic and inhumane and probably doomed to fail. And so I would encourage us to take the compassion we, I hope, show our colleagues, show it to ourselves, and then also show it to our students, because learning is not predictable and unilinear and automatic. It's a very complicated thing, and we are human with all of these social and emotional and cognitive and physical considerations. So we need to keep all that in mind.
Dr. Bloom, can I just say I'm so glad you said that, because my son's in college and I will never forget, he's doing this thing called a 168-hour assignment where the instructor asked them to document. And then there's this instruction for every, one, class you're taking 3 units, you've got to account for 9 hours to work on that class outside of class. And he does this assignment and he looks at me and says, "Mom, I'm done. And can you just check it for me?" And I go through and I go, "When are you eating? When are you going to brush your teeth?" Like, I looked at this and it just seems so unrealistic, and he's completely supported by me. And I just thought about students that work, go to, have children. All of it. And I thought to myself, like, how we have to reframe what we like that. I feel like that's so, we have to change that ideology that for every 3-unit class, they have to spend 9 hours and they have to block it out. And we have to keep that in mind as we are designing our courses. When Dr. Dias talks about designing an ethical course, right? Like having ethical course design, how does that play into the way that we pace our courses and pace learning in our classes?
I want to add to that, and also to say how inspiring this whole event has been. Inspiring because there are teachers here asking hard questions and really wanting to do the work. And I think that's really important. And one of the things I'm hearing echoed, but certainly in the last couple of comments, is the culture that we want to really transform, the culture of perfectionism, the culture of linearity, like this is this machine production. And if there's one thing we can take away from here is learning is a culture of being and growing. It's very human, and it's organic, it's complex, it's not predictable, and it's so beautiful if you would let the vulnerability happen. But as teachers, we too have grown up in the system. We don't like feeling this, what my students call the wobbliness. Well, I like solid ground, but let's accept that this is open space, and that the best, most joyful learning comes with that courage to be vulnerable. So as much as we need it, we have to bring that to our students. So if we have a year between now and the next meeting when we get together like this, maybe we can just allow some vulnerability and space and time and breath into our work.
Well, I'll take a breath right now. Phil, thank you so much, Dr. Dias. And we are luckily going to continue on these conversations, and I'm going to start moving us into, unfortunately, wrapping this wonderful symposium up with just some final information for our attendees here. So you've been seeing it posted in the chat, but here is that opportunity to continue that dialogue, right, between SLO Symposium 2021 and SLO Symposium 2022. Get involved, get in these Friday talks. This is a great community space for sharing and support, right? That is what we are trying to build. You could see as one of our outcomes for this event. You are not alone, as Sudhi was sharing, and some of the other things that we want to continue to reinforce. Lighting that fire for learning, right? Humanizing education, disrupting education. That is the space where we are going to meet together to continue that work. Also here, so to get information on those events and other resources that YARC and folks will send out, make sure to join the listserv so that you get on the mailing list for that. We will be emailing the conference attendees for this, but also encourage your colleagues to join that network as well. And then thank you, and I will turn it over to YARC for closing.
Well, what can I say? Thank you very much for attending. Thank you again, the planning team. It has truly been inspirational. Fantastic event in so many different ways. The quality of discussions and the quality of exchange, the networking. It all played out much better than I thought it ever would. I'm grateful that we were able to overcome the technological problems. Looking forward to collaborating with you. As Stacy just said, don't hesitate to stay in touch. Don't forget that we are not alone. We are really learning leaders. Looking forward to collaborating with you all in the next year until the next symposium. Thank you all.